Hello and welcome to Illumination Podcast with Nick and Kisma, bringing you ancient wisdom for modern day success so that you can have the mindset to get your life and business set.
As always, thank you for tuning in. And if you're new to the podcast, take a quick second to hit the subscribe button in iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. If you want to get the inside info for this and every episode, as well as some free gifts, go to illuminationacademy.net/podcasts. And now let's dive in to get your mindset for your life and business set.
Hello and welcome to Illumination Podcast with Nick and Kisma. I'm Kisma and we're really excited for the show today. We have a very dear friend, a teacher, someone who has traveled the world and spent a great deal of time in India. So we're going to get to talking with and interviewing Glen Callahan in just a moment. But before we start, hey Nick, how are you today?
I'm fantastic, Kisma. How are you?
Are you sure, given that you tried to do the intro like 5 times and it didn't work?
Why do you got to out me with that in front of the whole podcast audience? I'm good. Yeah, no, I'm really good. Yeah. You know, I like sometimes with those ones when it's got to like say a certain thing, that's when I start to like, ooh, I'm not really sure, but it happens. But other than that, I'm doing really well. How about you?
I'm great. And then of course the door rang and the dog barked, and it's always an event over here at Illumination Academy. But I'm good too. I mean, we've been super busy with our things, but I know we're very excited for this interview with Glen because he's somebody that has definitely helped us on our journey and continues to do so. So why don't we just bring him on? Hey there, Glen. How are you?
G'day, guys. I'm good.
So glad you're here. Thanks for taking the time because I know you as well have a very busy schedule.
Thank you. Nice to be on.
Well, we wanted to, I've been wanting to have you on the show for quite a while now, and I'm really excited that you're here. And we kind of wanted to learn a little bit more about you. Like one of the things that I've noticed at the Academy is whenever I'm visiting there is it's a little difficult to pry any personal information out of some of the students there, and like, you know, what brought them into Vedanta and hearing a little bit about that. It's very much about the teachings, which is cool.
Yeah.
But I would love to learn a little bit more about you. And if you could start us off, just tell me a little bit about where did you come from and how did you happen into Vedanta, and take it from there.
So the first thing I'll touch on is your observation that it's kind of hard to get personal information out of people at the Vedanta Academy, because you're absolutely right. The moment you try and talk about someone's backstory, they sort of avoid the subject entirely. A lot of this is because of one of the main things that we're learning at the Academy, which is to relate to your experiences in life in a way that is not to personalize everything. And so the students at the Academy, and any student of this philosophy in general really, is trying to pull that personalized perspective out of their daily life. And so when you sort of ask someone about their backstory, usually there's a bit of hesitancy to sort of talk about me and my story and what I went through, and I did this and I did that, because we're sort of trained to try and just filter that out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So basically the opposite of everything that we've learned in our daily lives in our modern world.
It's fantastic. It's really interesting to watch. You see people come to the Academy when they first get there and they ask questions, and you can see that they're asking a very sort of personal question in the sense that it's coming from their background and it's coming from what they want to know. And as they spend time there, the questions have that same basic quality, but this time you see the way that the language has been structured within the question to depersonalize it. So you get that sort of growth and understanding the more time that you spend there, that, look, it's not about me. It's about the principles. It's about the ideas. It's about the knowledge, the wisdom that we're trying to gain here. But having said that little preface to explain why you won't get much of a story out of me, I will go into a little bit about how I came across Vedanta. I think that it's instructive because I'm not necessarily exactly the sort of person you would expect to have found Vedanta. I had looked at various religions, I had looked at various New Age philosophies, I had looked at various traditions and organizations and groups and all sorts of other things to try and fill that sort of what I now recognize as a spiritual or a philosophical longing. You know, there's a domain of the human personality that sort of is seeking the unknown and wants to sort of know something that's a little bit beyond just what the world presents in front of us. And that usually is the domain of, the religions. Unfortunately, they've done such a terrible job, or at least the way that the religions are being promoted and practiced, they just don't fulfill that purpose anymore. And so I'd gone from one place to the next, to the next, to the next, sort of looking for something a little more meaningful than, get up, go to work, have lunch, come home, have dinner. On the weekends, you go out, that sort of standard life.
Right.
And I had come across these strange words like Atman and Brahman and Sannyasi in a text that I picked up when I was in a yoga class. And that sort of got me heading in the direction of the Vedantic philosophy. So I started looking, at this point I was living in Australia, and I started looking in the local library for Vedic philosophy. And the search results came out with a book by the name of Vedanta Treatise by an author named A. Parthasarathy. And so I picked the book up and started reading it, and it just took off. It just exploded inside my mind. It was exactly what I was looking for. It was addressing the sort of philosophical or spiritual dimension of the personality, but doing it in a way which was completely stripped of all of the sort of dogmatic assertions, stripped of all of the cultural niceties that are surrounding so much of the philosophical aspect, and it was logical.
Because you have an engineer mind, correct?
Yeah, I did a master's in engineering at university, and so my natural inclination is if it doesn't make sense, then I'm not going to believe it. And this was my problem with, I say, all of these other aspects, is the religions and New Age philosophies. They had some nice ideas, but nothing that was rooted in anything that had any intellectual rigor. And that was the primary focus of my teacher, Swami Parthasarathy, because everything is rooted in what you know and what you can prove with logic, reason, and evidence. And so you start with what you know and then move on from there. And it doesn't require that you belong to a particular faith or tradition. It doesn't belong, you don't need to belong to any particular school of thought. It's just the investigation into the principles that govern my particular experience, every human being's experience. Why do I experience my world the way I do? Why do I make the choices that I make? Why am I happy? Why am I sad? Why am I suffering? And the more you can dig into these questions and get the answers, then you can start to, gain a greater depth of understanding of what your own life is actually all about.
I love that. That right as the train of truth comes by. From the time you picked up the book, and were you working in Australia? Is that because your native country is New Zealand, correct?
Yeah, correct. I'd moved to Australia in 2003. I was working in Australia, and speaking of trains, in fact, luckily to get to work, it took me a train and a bus. And so I would sit there absorbed in this book on the train, absorbed on the bus, and on the way home as well.
Did you ever miss your stop?
No. I never missed on my way to work, no.
So from the time you found this text, this book, which is phenomenal, and we'll have a link of that as well in the show notes, when did you go to India, or when did you hear him speak, Swami Parthasarathy?
This would have been around 2004 I first picked up the book, and then he was actually, one of his students was conducting study classes in Perth in Australia where I was living. And so I contacted that guy and asked, do you have any classes coming up? I attended his classes for a number of months. The first time I heard Swamiji speak was in Perth. So Swamiji was coming for a lecture, some public lectures. I listened to him speak, had an interview with him, and discussed, a few questions that I had. And then about 6 months later, I was traveling in Europe, and on my way back, I decided to stop in at the Vedanta Academy, which is his educational institution in India. So my reason for stopping back there was really just to see a little more about the philosophy that he was teaching, the way that it was being taught, get an idea of the people who were attending and, what they were getting out of it. So I spent a lot of time speaking to the students when I first arrived. And this is exactly the same thing. I try and get everybody's backstory.
Right, right.
What brought you here? Why are you here now? What did you enjoy? What have you got out of this? And you get all these, vague answers.
I wanted to just back up for a second into what you described as like a spiritual longing, and what you now understand, to be this void that Swamiji speaks about endlessly throughout his texts. But what I'm wondering is like, what was that particular experience like for you? Like, did you just feel like I'm missing something? Were you in destructive behaviors in your life, or were you just feeling like lost, or like there's something more? Like how did that show up in your life?
Yeah, all of the above. Yeah. So, yeah, it started out, I guess, just as a dawning realization, exactly sort of like I said, you get up, you go to work, you do your work, you have your lunch, you finish the rest of the day, you drive home, you sit in front of the TV. You know, there's a sort of a routine existence that I naturally fell into, sort of by herd instinct. You just do what everyone else does. You finish a degree, you know, find a partner, get a job, and you know. And it started to be, and you know, my life was perfect per se. The job was great. You know, I was living in a fantastic area. I was back in New Zealand at this point, and there was this growing sense of constriction. That there's got to be a lot more to my existence than just this. You know, how long does this go on for? You know, and so that was sort of starting to spur that search for a little deeper meaning. You know, what is the meaning of my life per se? Why am I here? Why am I doing anything? Okay, I'm here now. How I got here, I don't know. Don't need to figure that out. But now that I'm here, now what? And the mundaneness of my life started to become very oppressive. And of course, you know, when we don't have adequate knowledge, that's when we do get into destructive behaviors, because we find as many different ways as we can to try and alleviate that sense of constriction or alleviate that sense of dissonance or tension. And because we don't know any better, we find ways that aren't going to be healthy for us. And so, yeah, we get into all that kind of stuff as well. And I kind of feel like that process of going through that stress and that tension, that in a sense forced me to look for something else. And so that was where it started to really propel me to look for something.
It's interesting to me because you're describing what Swamiji has taught so often about when one begins to ask that question, is this all there is? And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, how he mentions it's part of the subtle intellect, or just, you know, that piece of awareness is the beginning of this journey, because all of a sudden you're like, this can't be it, folks. Like, there's got to be something else. And I know many people never arrive to that point. They don't ask that question, but the ones that do, it's like there's a spark that's lit, and there's really no turning back from that point.
Yeah, it's a matter of, I guess you can say, introversion or extroversion. You know, if you're, and I know that your listeners are probably familiar with those terms. What I would say is temporarily forget or suspend whatever you currently understand by these words. And the context here, introvert, extrovert, simply refers to the direction of your thoughts. So if you're all the time, your attention is focused out on the external world, and then there's always that sense of trying to gain something from it, the next action, the next achievement, the next success, the next whatever, the next pleasure. The moment we turn introvert, what that means is that we are now not just looking at the external world as the cause of our experiences, but we're starting to look at our internal disposition. So we become more aware of what's going on inside and start to question the etiology of those experiences. And that introverted direction of thinking is really that marks the beginning of a spiritual path. You know, the thoughts are no longer directed outwards away from the center. Now they're being directed in towards the center.
And okay, so now you're at the academy on your first visit there. You're trying to pry information out of people and probably not getting very far with it. What was it for you that, like, what did you walk away with from that trip, or did you even walk away from that trip? Did you just stay?
So I didn't walk away so much as float away, is what I like to say. I had about 10 days, I think it was, and the academy was about half empty because a lot of the people were away on long trips. Swamiji was away on a international tour. So when he got back, of course, the academy blossomed back into full activity. And the first lecture that he held after his return was really what clinched it for me. You know, I was describing what I was experiencing when I was living back home. And the lecture that he gave was discussing, in essence, exactly the reason that I had arrived at the academy. I can remember thinking during the lecture, this guy has watched the DVD of my life and then written a 60-minute lecture just for me.
Oh my gosh.
This was these, obviously I didn't know that was the case, but that was the sense that I had. And the reason that I understand now is because he was talking about universal human experiences. Mm-hmm. That when you relate to your life in a particular way, you will feel oppressed, constricted. There'll be a sense of meaninglessness. There'll be a sense of oppression. There'll be agitation. There'll be grasping for more and more and more without really achieving any sort of satiety. And so because he was talking about universal human principles, of course, I thought he's talking about me. No, he's talking about all of us. I just happened to fit the category of people he was talking about at that time. And so that was really what clinched it for me, was that I thought, yes, this guy knows what he's talking about, because everything that he has said I have experienced.
Wow. I mean, what I was going to say is that's really powerful. I mean, this is a life-changing decision, just so that everybody kind of, all the listeners like kind of get that piece. Like, we're talking about uprooting everything in your life, leaving it behind, and moving to an ashram in India for 3 years.
Yeah.
So that's a powerful moment. It
is. Although I have to say, at that point, I didn't feel like I was giving up very much, because as I say, I'd spent a period of time sort of looking around me and thinking, this cannot be it. There's got to be something else. So the world around me sort of didn't seem to have a lot of color in it anyway. So to me, it was just like, okay, let's try this.
Yeah.
But there certainly are other people who have come to the Academy and they have had to give up a lot more, and they have had to work against environmental pressures, family pressures, parental pressures to get to the Academy and stay there. So it is independently true that to make that decision to go and study for 3 years, it does mark a sort of you cross a line within yourself when you make that decision.
Yeah, and it really must be your decision, because I can imagine, I don't know what your family was like, but like you said, some other students would have the pressure from outside. You can't do that. You can't go to India. You just, even if they're in India, you can't go to an ashram.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because, you're correct. Like, what are we giving up? We have all these attachments to these objects and situations in our external surroundings, but when one gets a glimpse of what it's like to understand the higher teachings, or to have a sense of peace in our mind, and to understand there's something way more than this, it's seemingly like, what's the big deal? I'll give it all away and be there. But when it comes down to the human personality, right, that's like a big decision for many people.
Yeah. And these are the genuine impediments in our human development, is our attachments. Our attachments are the egocentric notions of what is valuable, and they're, in a sense, they're immaturities. A child thinks toys are valuable, a teenager thinks popularity is valuable, an adult thinks a good career is valuable, a middle-aged person thinks a healthy family is valuable, an older person thinks a properly planned estate is valuable. Everyone's got their own level that they're at, that they consider this is the most important thing. And it's that particular attachment which holds us back. It's all of those attachments that are holding us back.
Well, speaking of describing, somebody's life, that's like basically the experience that I go through every time I'm there, is, this is so amazing. Oh, there's the train of truth for me. It's so amazing, and I know, in a certain way how important that is, and that there are things there that I simply will not get from the other aspect of my life, so it's always really interesting. And I got to say that every person I've talked to, you in particular, and Saskia in particular as well, you guys are the best at objection handling, because every time I come up with one, you've got an ironclad comeback that's just like, yep, that's silly. So every time I leave, I'm always just left with my own choice of like, okay, cool. Like, I am totally actively choosing to just go back into the world and keep doing what I'm doing, and to do my best out here, which is always a very interesting experience.
Ultimately, it's not about where you are. It's ultimately, that's irrelevant. You can be living in an ashram, you can be living in a monastery, you can be living in a school or a philosophical institution, and be more worldly and more caught up in your own attachments than somebody who's out raising a family and running a business.
Yeah.
It's got nothing to do with your position in the community. It's got nothing to do with the work or the actions that you perform. Spirituality, the practice of spirituality, is marked by the conscious thought force that we're putting into the way that we relate to the world. And you can be spiritual in the world, as it were, and you can be highly unspiritual in a place like an ashram in India, So
that's so perfect.
That's really the main thing to take away from it. Having said that, if you decide that the most important thing for you to do is to spend some time in consistent, quiet reflection and self-contemplation, then you will probably need an environment that is conducive for that. It's very difficult to put a consistent amount of time and effort into that particular endeavor if you have to worry about running a family and running a business and shopping, eating, and all that kind of stuff. So you might take yourself to an environment which allows you a lot more psychological space to perform that sort of activity.
Totally agree. I mean, this is why I know for our listeners, we go to study group just about every week with Glen. And one of those things that we hear from you, we've always heard from Swamiji, is to get up early and study. And that definitely is a game changer. I know the mornings that I sleep in and don't get to the study, it's not as brilliant of a day. That's the best way I can describe it. It just doesn't have that brilliance to it.
The analogy that I often discuss is, and in Southern California here, it's easy because so many people here are physically active. And I know so many people for whom a daily exercise routine, they gym or they jog or whatever they do, is essential, and they won't miss it. It's because they recognize, if I get up in the morning and do some exercise and then go to work, I feel more energetic, I feel more awake, I feel more, So exercise has that effect, and so they're quite happy to do an exercise regime every day. But what people aren't aware of is that exact same phenomenon, that exact same discipline is there at the intellectual level as well.
So true.
And if you can start to see the value for doing a daily intellectual exercise regime, your intellectual gymnasium, then same thing happens. You face your day with more of an intellectual sharpness, more of an intellectual clarity. And that has a huge impact on the way that you deal with your own emotions, the way that you deal with the people and the events around you, and the overall direction that your day and ultimately your life starts to take.
So true. Thank you for sharing that. There's a question that's pinging me. There's two, but let's start with this one. Once you got to the academy, moved in, got settled, was there ever a day or time where you're like, I'm going to go? Like, what have I done?
It was strange. There were times when I would look around myself and think, what am I doing here? How did I get here? There were times where it was extraordinarily difficult to remain at the academy for the simple reason that as a Westerner, we're used to having all of the things that satisfy our immediate demands sort of at arm's length.
This is so true.
And whenever you want it, you go and contact it, and you feel relatively stable and happy and all the rest of it. When you go to a place like an ashram in India, many of those things are essentially taken away. Now, I mean, they're not taken away. You've chosen that environment, and that's not, and they're not in there. So, but of course, to the mind with its attachments, it starts to rebel and says, "You've taken away my, Friday night drinks, and you've taken away my movies, and you've taken away my flirting with, the girls, and you've taken away this and that and the other. You've taken away all of these things, and so of course the mind rebels.
Yeah,
and you get this emotional rebellion. So it can become extremely frustrating to be there. It's not true for everybody. It depends upon your past history. But for me, it certainly was. And I have to say that as frustrated as I got, I would often say to myself, okay, so you're frustrated, you're unhappy. If you could wave a magic wand and be anywhere in the world doing anything at all, what would you choose? And it always came back to, I'd be doing this. I'd be here at this academy, studying this knowledge under this incredible teacher. And the moment you recognize that, the mind sort of, okay.
Yeah. Fine. It's such a part of building the resiliency, right? That self-examination, going through not having those niceties that you have at home. Although, we know the students are so well taken care of.
Yeah.
Is there ever a time, whether it was you or another student or, several other students, where did Swamiji or other senior students, do they get a pulse when a student's getting that frustration, or are you just expected to work through it on your own?
There's definitely a pulse from some of the senior students. As you pointed out, I had spent 8 years at the academy, and after about 6 or 7 years, I began to notice some very common themes and some common cycles and some common trends amongst the different students. Mm-hmm. And so those students that have been there for significantly longer than that, they will have an attunement to what the students are going through. And then each person, there's a mixture. To an extent, you are, of course, working through it on your own. Mm-hmm. But all of those senior students are there. They're a fantastic resource. And I have to say, this is something I think that, I wasn't aware of during my time as a course student, mm-hmm. was just what an amazing resource all of these senior students are. But what's interesting is that one of the fundamental principles that the academy runs on is that knowledge is taken, not given. So there's very much people are very disinclined to spoon feed you. So what that means is that if you want help, it's your responsibility to approach somebody and ask for it. And once you ask for it, it's all there in front of you, Mm-hmm. But you've got to take that first step.
It's such an important first step. It really changes the entire dynamic. That's the moment that, you're actually ready to receive it as well, which is interesting. So you did the 3-year course, and then if I understand correctly, there was a point where you went back home for a short while?
So I completed the entire residential program, which for me was about 3.5 years. Okay. Then after that, I hadn't seen my family for 3.5 years or even longer. So I decided to go back to New Zealand and spend some time with family and sort of reacquaint myself with the Western living. I spent about 5 months back in New Zealand, taking some study classes, catching up with family and friends, etc. And then during that time there, I was reflecting on whether or not I would want to go back to the academy and continue studying, or whether I'd like to stay in New Zealand and do some other work. Mm-hmm. And during the course of my time there, it became clear that I wanted to go back. There was definitely what I would consider some unfinished business. So I decided to go back to the academy and I spent another 4 years there, or 4.5 years there, as a senior student or a postgraduate student.
Well, what was it like coming back into the Western world after that experience? Was it disturbing to you, or were you fully equipped?
No, in fact, for me, it was seamless. I have spoken to some people for whom the return sort of back to quote-unquote normal life was something of a culture shock, because they were used to living a certain way at the academy, used to being surrounded by philosophically minded people, people who are interested in striving towards higher values in their own life and personal growth. And so there was a common language that everyone sort of basically understood, a certain way of functioning that was recognized as being conducive for that personal growth and self-development. And then you go into quote-unquote the world, and that is not there to the same degree. And I know that some people found it a little bit troubling to readjust. Mm-hmm. I didn't have any of those problems. I stepped back in there after 3.5 or 4 years as if I'd been away for 3 days. And that, I think, was really a testament to the course structure at the academy.
Okay.
Its job is to, among other things, is to develop your objectivity so that you can step into changing environments without feeling that you're being thrown off balance. Just assessing the new environment that you've stepped into and reacting and relating to it in the most appropriate way that you can in the moment.
Yeah. Well, and clearly our trips are too short, because when I get to the Mumbai airport, I melt down. Like, what's happening? So I get it. The academy always, when we visit, and you were there for so many years, seems to be such a well-oiled machine. It's just like, if you could take a few moments and talk about what it's like day to day, because I know every day is pretty much the same day. But also, Glen, what was life as a postgraduate senior student like in comparison to being in the 3-year course?
So you've seen a swan swimming on the river, on the lake, yeah?
Yes.
Beautiful, graceful thing above the water, legs furiously pumping underneath. You don't see what's going on underneath the water. So yeah, the Academy does operate like a well-oiled machine, but it's there's a lot of hard work consistently going in to keep it running in that way. Mm-hmm. I think probably one of the biggest factors in terms of the success of the Academy's functioning is the fact that there is an overarching spirit of cooperation in the place. Now, like any relatively enclosed environment, like a workplace or a family or a small community, you're going to find political intrigues and personalities bumping up against each other and all the rest of it, like you do in any human society. Mm-hmm. But, so while all that, normal human interaction is there is one other thing. There is something that kind of, in a sense, unites everybody, and that is their own commitment to self-development, but also a recognition of the value of the organization itself. That these values, this knowledge, this method of subjective inquiry is so valuable. It's so important that we keep these sorts of ideas alive, that we make sure that people are exposed to them. And so everyone has a sense of the value of the organization. And so it's a matter of having that common ideal. And that's what allows the Academy to come together. And you've got people who are from wildly different backgrounds, people that have come straight from high school in a rural town in India, and then you've got people in their middle age from the West that are successful business people, business owners. A range of different backgrounds, different temperaments, ages, intelligence levels, you name it. And yet, we get this cohesive unit working. And there's no better really place to see that than during the week-long retreats that are held at the Academy. Yeah. Because the entire retreat, everything from the room layout to the food to the yoga schedules, from start to finish, it's all run by the Academy students. And we've had high-end corporate retreats come to the Academy, and one of the participants said, "Who do you use? Who's your management company that you're using to run this place?"
Who's your event planner?
Who are your event planners? They've done an amazing job. Everything's just seamless. And, of course, the answer is, well, you've been having dinner with them every night for the last 6 days. Yeah. It's everyone in the Academy. And so that's why the Academy runs as a cohesive unit, because there is this overarching sense of cooperation, because there is a common ideal towards what the Academy represents and the work of Swami Parthasarathy.
Wow. And it really brings us back to kind of what we started with of how through the teachings and through the study, you're basically just taking out that personalization step by step along the way. So it allows to me, like, that's the thing that allows these extremely diverse people to all work together towards that common goal as seamlessly as you do.
Yeah, the biggest problem in human interaction is me and my opinion, me and my feelings. Okay, you've got your opinion, fine. You've got your feelings, fine. There's no problem. The problem is that we become attached to what I think, I'm right, and because of that attachment, we, as you pointed out earlier, we don't have that ability to genuinely communicate with another person. We're not looking to communicate. We're just waiting to say the bit that we've got bouncing around inside our head. And so that communication with another human being, that connection, is destroyed by our own self-centeredness, by our own selfishness. And that is one of the main themes that you see constantly running through all of the work at the Academy. Circumvent the mind's selfishness by implementing an ideal. Fix an ideal in life. The intellect thinks up something that is genuinely worth striving for, that is outside your own selfish demands, and then you fix that as kind of a guiding light. And while you maintain your awareness of the ideal, then what you're doing is naturally shifting out of your own egocentric perspective and into a wider one. And that's what facilitates that kind of communication.
Well, it's really a sight to see in motion. Yeah. On our last trip, we had an opportunity to interview Sunandaji, who is Swamiji's daughter, and it was really an amazing opportunity for us. She wouldn't record with us for various reasons, which I'm sure you understand, but we did do an episode about that interview. And one of the things that I found really curious about it and interesting is Swamiji's approach to, really having an equality between men and women and really treating them equally, and how he's been very progressive with that. I know that one of the things that, you see in a lot of different ashrams or other spiritual sects, for that matter, is celibacy, and to not have that. And I know that that's something you're married, it's not something that is taught there. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit, I guess it's a little weird, a guy asking another guy about, what do you think about Swamiji's attitude towards women? But really, I'm curious of how that plays out in the academy between the boys and the girls, so they call themselves, but the men and the women, and the interaction, and why you feel like that's important, and also the ability to have a partner is important.
See, I mean, this idea of celibacy, I'm glad you brought it up, because in fact, celibacy is very much promoted as a healthy way to live your life, but this hinges upon a correct understanding of what celibacy is. Celibacy is not about what your body does. Celibacy is about the mental attitude that you adopt while you're acting. It's a little bit like the phrase out of the New Testament. Jesus says it's not what goes into a man's mouth that defiles him, but what comes out of it. So the body's eating. Who cares if the body's eating? But what's the mental and the intellectual orientation during that action? What comes out of it means, what's the state of your own mind? Mm-hmm. So a celibate person is not someone who does not have sex. That doesn't define celibacy. And when celibacy or when self-restraint is enforced externally, there's a beautiful line in one of his texts. He says, desire for anything increases with prohibition. And the moment there is an external prohibition on any particular activity, especially something as natural and visceral as the sexual urge, then all that happens is that desire is inflamed and strengthened. And so what happens is you increase the internal pressure, the desire, the demand, the thinking and the feeling about sexual activity, and yet you inhibit the physical expression. Well, this is exactly the definition of what suppression is. And so that person is not practicing celibacy. That person is practicing self-denial. That person is practicing torture, self-torture. They're practicing suppression, and it's obviously very unhealthy. So celibacy in the more subtle sense, in terms of the inner world part of it, is to have a correct value for in this case, the sensual experiences. Okay, so I'll give an example of what we mean by this. So whenever we're discussing celibacy, Swamiji always brings up two characters. One is Krishna, who is the teacher in the Bhagavad Gita. And now he's known as a perpetual celibate, someone who's always celibate. And yet, in the texts, you see that Krishna has some ridiculous number of wives, 1,000 or 16,000 or something, whatever it is. He's got a huge number of wives. And he's performing his husbandly obligations. So he's performing his physical obligations towards his wives. And you can say, well, how can he be someone who is perpetually celibate and at the same time engaging in sexual activity? These two don't make sense. So the reason that we say that Krishna is a celibate is because even though his body is going through the action, as it were, he's not dependent upon it for his internal sense of satisfaction. He's not using it as a way to egocentrically draw pleasure from the world. I want. So it's not what you do that matters. It's the orientation. It's the attitude that you adopt during it. And it's really important that you have a correct understanding of your own temperament so that you will know what the appropriate thing to do is.
Wow.
So, for example, and this is something that you see, people who get into, say, they get enthusiastic or inspired to get into a spiritual practice. And so they say, no sex, and I've stopped drinking, and no more drugs, and no more smoking, and no more gambling, and so on and so forth. And they give up all of these things, and it doesn't sustain itself. You've got to look at your own personality and say, okay, my body has all of these physical demands. It has a natural, healthy sexual urge. What am I going to do with it? Ask that question. Okay, now what about my mind? Do I feel that I need a sense of companionship? Am I self-sufficient enough to be alone for the next 50, 60 years? To come home and know that, once I close the door, there's no one else walking in that door after me. Can I live that way? And I might decide, okay, I'd like to be able to be self-sufficient, but right now I'm not. I have these physical demands. I have these emotional demands. Therefore, great, go and get into a marriage, have a partnership. Mm-hmm. So what it means is that we use the intellect's capacity to reflect, and we apply it to every domain of existence. We apply it to every choice that we make to ensure that we're making the choice that is most appropriate for us. One person, the most appropriate choice might be to stay unmarried for the rest of his life. That might be what is perfect for him. And if we follow that, we become frustrated. What's perfect for me is get married.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Well, speaking of that, Natalie, let's hear a little bit, because we need to let our listeners know you're in the LA area. Natalie is your wife, and we met her at the Academy too. So how did that come about? Like, I'm sure it wasn't an arranged marriage. Like, you guys really cared for each other. Did you get permission from Swamiji? Does that happen, or is it just do what you do?
So what happened for us, I had finished my course. Natalie was a couple of years into her 3-year course. And as you say, we met and we hit it off and found a sort of a natural resonance with each other. And then there was, I think, for both of our parts, going through that analysis that I was discussing earlier. Mm-hmm. What am I going to do about this area of my life? Am I going to take a partner? Am I going to get married? Why would I? Why wouldn't I? What would it mean? What would it look like? Do I want to have children? Do I want to stay childless? All of these questions started to go through. And we found just from our sort of casual conversations that to a large extent, the values that we both held in this area were very similar. And that was the most important starting point. Anytime we're looking to get into a relationship, we've got to start to ask ourselves, well, on what basis are we getting into it? And usually we don't ask ourselves that. So you could imagine two people who get into a relationship based purely on physical attraction. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, you imagine two people who get into a relationship purely because there's an emotional fit. Or you find people who get into a relationship because they have a similar set of ideals and values to live by, a similar morality, a similar spiritual outlook. So when the relationship is based on the subtlest aspect of the personality, then you have a much more solid and lasting foundation for it. If you base your relationship on a physical attraction, well, if you've ever gone through that, we know what that's like. It does not take long for that physical thrill of novelty to diminish. It's a natural phenomenon.
Right.
Over a period of time, you simply don't get the same physical thrill from being with your partner or from seeing your partner that you did in the early stages. You certainly can't expect to. Mm-hmm.
Or in my case, is to just have that be totally overshadowed by the drama of the relationship and everything falling to pieces.
Are you talking about us?
No, I'm not.
Just had to check in there.
So that was a good starting point for us. And then it became obvious that there was a natural attraction between the two of us. And we both sort of said at that point, okay, it's here, but let's just... we're here for a different reason at the moment. Let's just stay with the study and so on and so forth. But we did go and discuss it with Swamiji. So for those perhaps listeners who aren't aware, he's not just the main teacher at the Academy, but he also acts very much as a personal mentor for many of the students. Mm-hmm. And so when there are personal problems that people are trying to tackle, they'll go to him and ask for his advice. Or the way I used to always think about it was just go and cast a different perspective on the problem, because he always had this ability to view the situation from a perspective that I had not considered. And that was always very instructive in two ways. One, just the new perspective and new facts, but also it just has to act as a reminder that there's so much you don't know. Right. And you're trying to make decisions based on limited understanding. Just recognize your limited understanding. It's a huge benefit to your own thinking. And so we both went and spoke to him about what we had observed happening, and he said that it's a good match. It's a fantastic idea. If you guys want to go ahead and get married in the near future, by all means, do it. Aww. So that was good because we didn't actually go there to get advice on that per se, but he saw the relationship and fully supported it.
Mm. Does he ever lay a smackdown and just be like, "No, that's a horrible idea. You two should not be married and be together"?
Yes.
My! I wasn't expecting that.
He said it to me, but I have heard that he said it to others. I haven't heard it firsthand, so this is secondhand knowledge. But he's duty bound to tell you what's in your best interest, in the sense that this academy exists for our own intellectual, moral, and spiritual development. That's why we're here. Mm-hmm. That's the existence of the academy, and that's the existence of the teacher. And so if you go and ask him a question, I've fallen for this girl, what do you think? If he thinks it's a terrible idea,
he'll speak the truth. Yeah,
I've never known him to not speak his mind.
Yeah. So tell us what you and Natalie are up to these days and how our listeners can find you. I mean, I do want to say if anybody's in San Diego or LA, there's, study groups as well, but just share a little bit about what's going on in the Vedanta LA world.
Yeah, so the backbone of our work is the ongoing study classes. So we take one of the texts that we studied at the academy, and we go through it paragraph by paragraph. We understand the content of the paragraph, what it's trying to say, and then also how it's practically applied in daily life, how an understanding of this particular principle will change the way that we view our life and the choices that we make, etc. Mm-hmm. So those are free and open to the public. And they're going, as you say, they're on an ongoing basis in Los Angeles and San Diego. We also run things like one-day workshops, 3-day retreats. We do introductory talks. We do training with corporate groups for things like, emotional management, stress management, teamwork, cooperation, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And we've also recently started creating some programs specifically for youngsters. So kids who are sort of between 12 and 18, as you're going through that phase where you're starting to develop some intellectual autonomy from the family and from your parents, you're starting to pull away from their ideals and try to formulate, what do I think about the world and how it works and what do I think is right and wrong. It gives a lot of guidance in terms of how to arrive at those answers. It doesn't tell us what those answers are, but what it does do is instructs us how to find those answers for ourselves. And if someone at the age of 14, 15, 16 can start to develop the habit for self-reflection, then a huge amount of attachment and relationship disharmony, personal stress and anxiety will be immediately eliminated from their future. So we're also hoping to get this to youngsters as much as possible.
That's incredible, and such an important time for that. It's just outstanding. And for our listeners too, just the study group that we attend, and just by the way, I know I've told this to you, but I don't want the whole world to know like how incredibly grateful we are that you're trekking on down to San Diego weekly in order for those classes to happen. It's really and truly such an incredible gift. And
you're welcome.
Yeah, and it's so amazing too because sure, we're going through the text and we are going through paragraph by paragraph and discussing it, your knowledge of it and fluidity with expressing that in a way that we can understand is really incredible. But what I also want to share is that how it sparks such amazing discussions amongst us and also along, the participants as well as your input with that and really seeing how does this apply in everyday life. And I think, if I understand correctly, based on my experiences at the academy, is you maybe give us a little bit more leeway than Swamiji would with some of those questions. And it's much appreciated because it's really helpful to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, we want the classes and, in fact, all of our programs, we want the sessions to be as interactive as possible. We want people's doubts. We want people's dissent. We want people to argue. Yeah, it's nice when people sit there and nod, but it's a lot nicer when people sit there and shake their head. and say, hang on, that doesn't make sense. Or, it doesn't happen so much in the classes. It tends to happen more in sort of the introductory talks. But, we want people's reactions, and we want people's questions more than anything else. The whole practice of this knowledge is to develop the capacity to question everything. And that's why these ideas are presented. And as you know, going through the text, they get more and more subtle. They get more and more abstruse. They get more and more philosophically hair-splitting as you go on. And that's a natural practice to refine your thinking capacities.
Yeah, and it's so incredibly valuable because I think so often we'll take in information and want to take it in and then figure it all out ourselves, which there is that reflective quality to this and the practice of that reflection. But the flip side of that, of having a forum to discuss that, a place to bring up your doubts and your concerns, where they're not only, not frowned upon, but really, really and truly welcomed, to bring those things up for discussion is truly amazing, because it allows that to kind of flush out and allows you to kind of talk through some of those things to come to a greater understanding yourself. And what I always appreciate too is that you've never anybody from the Vedanta world has ever, even in a small way, forced their opinion or their understanding on me. It was only ever put in a way that is inviting you to reconsider for yourself what that actually means to you.
Yeah, sorry, that comes straight from the top.
Yeah, it really does.
That is really what attracted me to the work of Swami Parthasarathy, was that everywhere, all throughout the text and all throughout the teachings, he's saying the same thing over and over. Don't swallow this just because you read it in a book. Don't believe it. Don't take it for granted. You've got to think about it for yourself. And if it makes sense to you, then you adopt it in your life. If it doesn't make sense to you, it's your obligation to not adopt it. And that was such a huge relief, because this is not true for every denomination or every tradition, but often you find in religions a very dogmatic approach. This is the text, and this tells you what to believe, and this tells you what's true. And if you don't believe the text, then you're not really part of us. There's a beautiful quote by Emerson where he talks about men's creeds are a disease of the intellect. And that's what a creed is. What do I think about gay marriage or abortion or euthanasia or drug policy, or what do I think about what the political situation? I don't have to think about it. I go back to my text; it will tell me.
Right.
I don't have to do the hard work of thinking about it. My creed will tell me what to think about. Intellect is diseased. You don't need to do your own thinking for yourself. Whereas the work of the Vedanta Academy is the exact opposite.
Mm-hmm.
It's
so
a buffet of thoughts. You've got to do your own thinking and arrive at your own conclusions. And that's the strength. That really is the strength of the Academy's rigorous daily discipline.
Wow. It's really amazing to me that this is, the most ancient philosophy, and it's actually still in this day and age is in so many ways the most revolutionary.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to put it. It is revolutionary. One of the things that I've heard Swamiji talk about a number of times is this idea of a paradigm shift, which is a bit of a catchphrase that we're all familiar with. But what's interesting is that he's talking about it purely as an internal dimension. We think about sometimes a paradigm shift in terms of, okay, we change our social structure, or we do something a different way. No, he's talking about having a completely internal shift in your values. And so it is revolutionary in that regard. It is kind of an internal revolution.
Yeah. And so many times we're looking for that external of, changing, it's a paradigm shift in our economy, a paradigm shift in our healthcare, or whatever that is. But really and truly that the true shift is inside, when somebody takes responsibility for, how they're being in their world and how they're creating in their world. It's really fascinating.
And both have to be there, service to our world, to our community, doing what we can to make our sphere of influence a better place. That's our obligation in life. We have an obligation to give, we have an obligation to help, we have an obligation to improve the lives of the people around us. But higher than that is, exactly as you say, that obligation to start within. Start working on your own values, question your own core values and the things that drive your choices.
Well, I got to tell you, I mean, I'm continually inspired by you and Natalie and the whole team, the whole West Coast team actually out here doing what you do in this world. What is your vision for this? If you could have it any way that you wanted, what do you want to see happen out here?
So as far as the growth of Vedanta Institute Los Angeles or the Vedanta community in California, it's really a matter of organic growth. So what that means is that the demand has to come from the environment. Knowledge is taken, not given. So whatever the future looks like, it will be hopefully in accordance with whatever the environment demands. And so for us at the moment, our work is making people aware that it exists, putting in front of people the notion that if you want a sort of secular spiritual development, if you want spirituality without religion, if you want a philosophical inquiry into the nature of your existence without having to get bogged down in dogma or cultural accretions, then there is this secular philosophy which can nurture that dimension of your personality without having to become fanatically attached to a group or a book or anything else. So that's our work at the moment, is spreading it wide. I'd like to see a permanent center set up somewhere where we could have ongoing classes, retreats, workshops in a single location. So that would be, I think, the short-term future vision, sort of 5 to 10 years. Mm-hmm. Long-term, maybe, say, 30 years ago, the word yoga was not really very well known. Mm-hmm. It wasn't as accepted. I mean, people knew what it was, but it wasn't as ubiquitous. The word Vedanta is not particularly well known. People have got a vague idea about it. It would be nice if in 15, 20 years, the word Vedanta as a method of subjective inquiry was as well known and as accepted and understood as, say, asana and pranayama are today.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I love it.
Well, where can our listeners find you for more information?
So we have a website. It's vedantala.org, which, as you said, will be on the story notes.
Yes.
We also have a YouTube channel, which you can link to from there. So if you just look for Vedanta Institute LA on YouTube, those are our main two platforms where you can see the work that we do. We've got videos of some of our classes. The website also has a blog, and the blog's a good way to get an idea of the sort of themes that we contact and the way that we address them and how we can apply them. So it's a good place to start if people want to learn more. Okay, great. Yes, we will have that both in the show notes. And to everyone listening, take a peek. Like this really, I know you refer to this as secular spirituality. Use that word secular, which I get it's not tied to any religion, any dogma, but it's really, to me, it's the most magical, not magical, highest form of using the human entity, right, to discover a new way of being, doing, and having. So I urge everyone to follow through and check it out. And before we go, Glenn, any last words of advice? No. Ask me a specific question, I'll give you a specific answer.
That is extremely Vedantan of you.
I'll just take it, not given.
Love it. So, everyone, I'll just say go take the knowledge.
Go get the knowledge, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. We so appreciate you and appreciate your time and really look forward. We'll see you on Thursday.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Thank you. Wow.
What, I know, mind blowing.
Yeah, it's just so great to hear somebody like that who's a part of that world and how they bring it into this modern life, from a very different perspective, and especially somebody who's really taken the deep dive into that study. It's just extraordinary. Such an inspiration. Yeah. So I just want to encourage everybody, check it out. Go check out the website, vedantala.org for sure, and just see what they're all about. If you happen to be in this area, then you're definitely going to want to check out one of their classes, or retreats or workshops. And if you're not, drop us a message or drop them a message and just see if there is somebody in your area. They have a person based in New Jersey, Gautam, who is extraordinary. Yeah. I know that they have a person based in Detroit, and if I'm not mistaken, I think there may be some others out and about that are teaching this. So there may be a class near you. And in the UK and Australia, and I'll also suggest everyone go back and listen again to this podcast, because as you just
listen to his words and the teachings, they begin to just take on a new life. And, the thing that really caught me was that word revolutionary. It's the oldest, you're right, Nick, it's like the oldest philosophy yet. It's revolutionary for our time.
Yeah, it's still, it is so revolutionary to our human experience. I love it. So thank you so much for listening, everybody. If you enjoyed the episode, please go ahead and give us a rating and review on iTunes or your other podcast listening apparatus. And if you got value from it, please, go ahead and share it with a friend. We'd so appreciate it. And it just brings a little bit more of this conversation out into the world, which I think is good for everybody. It's a win-win-win. So thank you so much and have an awesome day.
Namaste.
Peace.
Hey, thanks for jamming with us today. And if you enjoy Illumination Podcast, please go ahead and share it with someone you love. Give us a rating, review, download our podcast. And remember, you can find us at illuminationacademy.net/podcasts. Talk to you soon. Namaste.